Listening 5, Music Appreciation Class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a music appreciation class.
As you know, tonight's the concert that I want you to attend, so I'll keep the class short today. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of chamber music, so you'll be prepared to appreciate the music that you hear tonight. The University Quartet is one of the best in the region, so you'll be hearing an excellent example. Anyway, about chamber music. From medieval times through the 18th century, musicians in Europe had basically two options for employment: the church or the nobility. So, when they weren't creating pieces for religious occasions and performing at church functions, musicians were playing in the chambers of stately homes. Now, a chamber is the name for a room where guests may be assembled, kind of like a hall. And because of their association with this room, this chamber, the musicians who played for the wealthy patrons came to be known as chamber players. Chamber music is written to be performed by a relatively small group, more than one, but fewer than a dozen musicians. I should tell you that pieces for more than 8 players are unusual, though, and it's very rare to see a conductor. It may surprise you to know that any combination of instruments can be used for chamber music. The strings, woodwinds, and piano are so often associated with chamber music, and they remain the most popular even today, but chamber music has been written for other instruments as well. Well, the history of chamber music is usually divided into 3 distinct periods. In the classical period, and that extends from the mid-1700s to around 1820. So, in the classical period, chamber music, like many other expressions of the arts, it reacted to the extravagant Baroque style by creating new structures. And these structures expressed simplicity, balance, and order. It was the age of the Enlightenment, with the ideals of logic and reason. So, this translated into compositions with one melodic line. The line, the melody, it was usually written for the violin, and all other instruments provided an accompaniment. Early chamber music in the classical tradition often included the recorder, the harpsichord, and the viola. Vienna was a hub of activity for chamber music, and 3 composers dominated the artistic scene. Franz Joseph Haydn is generally credited with organizing the string quartet, and he produced more than 80 pieces for it, the quartet. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart also composed chamber music, including not only quartets, but also quintets and trios with clarinet, and even piano sonatas. Since the music was relatively simple, many amateurs played for their own enjoyment. This was new, but by then, music was being printed, and more people had access to it. So music rooms became popular, and people played chamber music as a social activity. Well, it was Ludwig van Beethoven who probably bridged between the classical period and the Romantic period. And I say that because his works were longer and perhaps more complex than his predecessors. And I find this amazing, since the later quartets were all created when he was totally deaf. In any case, composers and performers were beginning to break free of the formal confines of the classical period. Their works became increasingly more difficult, expressing some of the high emotions of the 19th century, which, as you will recall, the backdrop of that century, the French and the American revolutions, they were defining moments. So Chopin, Liszt, and Wagner wrote very little chamber music because they preferred the emotional power of the full orchestra, or the personal expression in a piano solo. It was also at about this time that Franz Schubert, Johannes Brahms, Felix Mendelssohn, and Antonin Dvorak made their contributions, and they wrote melodic, passionate compositions for chamber players. But now the music was more difficult to play, and the patronage system was declining anyway, so most chamber music moved from the great homes of the wealthy and into the concert halls, which were frequented by a growing middle class. And it was a very creative period for chamber music, and professional chamber groups emerged during this time. The composers probably felt a new freedom because they weren't so much pressed to please their patrons, and they could explore their art. Well, at the turn of the century, the modern period ushered in an opportunity for even greater experimentation. Painters were bringing Impressionism to the forefront of the artistic consciousness, and this was reflected musically in the work of Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. Their chamber music was considered revolutionary, Debussy and Ravel, because, unlike previous composers, their compositions had recurring themes instead of a continuous melody. And there are a number of other composers who wrote chamber music in the modern period, but whether they'll be remembered is, well, a question to be answered by future historians. What we do know is that the modernists gave chamber music new combinations of instruments and arrangements. And as the music became more unexpected, often with unusual tonality, well, it also became even more difficult to play. And that meant that the scores for modern chamber music had to be played by very skilled ensemble musicians. This evening, at the concert, the University Quartet will perform one of the classical pieces by Haydn. You'll hear the Quartet in D minor, Opus 76, number 2, third movement. There are 2 violins, 1 cello, and 1 viola. So, that said, I'll see you tonight.